I'm Josephine Finn, and I'm head of the Department of Adult and Community Education here at the National University of Ireland, Maynooth, County Kildare, in the Republic of Ireland. I've been working in adult education for 10 years, and I came back to education as a mature student and then continued my postgraduate studies in adult education, and I've worked here in the department more or less since I started full-time employment. So I have quite a long history in adult education, both as a student, as an educator, and now as head of this department. So I'm delighted to have an opportunity to speak to you about the trends in adult education in Europe and about the challenges that we face in a time of such catastrophic global economic downturns in most European countries, but across the world. So I'm going to try and say, I'm going to say a little bit about what adult education is like in Ireland, about the impact of this global downturn, a little bit about funding, and then a little bit about adult education as a discipline and the challenges for that. So I'm going to divide it up a little bit. I hope that's okay. Yeah, what has happened in Ireland is a lot of the community partnerships, as we call them, community groupings of one kind or another, have been amalgamated. So they have been rationalised, I think is the only way to describe them, into single units as opposed to a multiplicity of different ones. And I think they have struggled with that. So I think that's probably on the cards for most EU countries. But before there was ever EU funding, there was a very large community education movement in Ireland and community development movement, which was about local people taking or becoming involved in community work. And most of it, I think, was in a voluntary capacity, but they did fundraise and collect money on the ground for some of the work they were doing. And they also got development grants of one kind or another. So it had a different flavour to it, I think, because people were in it to improve their communities. And then it became professionalised in some way when the European money came in, and some of the people who had worked all their lives on the ground working in the community sector found themselves out of jobs because they didn't have the qualifications that were needed to lead up more professional organisations. I suppose if we were to think a little bit about trends for the future, one of the things that dominates discourses about education at the moment and the need for upskilling is the dominance of the idea of the knowledge economy. And this is, of course, a very valid thing for all of us to train for. But at another level, it belies other changing trends in our society. Some of them to do with an ageing population that need a lot of care into the future, but also need a lot of education and are looking for programs that address their learning needs at a later stage in their life cycle. Environmental movements are becoming very strong. Maynooth here is what we call one of these transition towns, where it's trying to evolve as quite a sustainable town in its own right. Even thinking about a local currency and a kind of credit system where people can exchange tokens for goods within the local community and the local businesses. I think there is also a movement for sustainable energy, and we're all aware of that and all the implications of it. And that's something that adult education has to pay a lot of attention to, because the shift to sustainable communities means that there is a role for adult education in supporting that shift and developing new paradigms for living and working, and we need to pay particular attention to that. There are some hot topics that are also in the rhetoric at the moment. One of them in particular is the whole notion of civic engagement. Adult education at NUI Maynooth has always had in its mission it pays attention to social justice matters, and that would be a very strong component of the work that we do in the community sector in particular. There is a concern, I think, in adult education in Europe that this agenda may become subsumed in a lifelong learning definition that is all about upskilling, that is about leisure courses. And both of those are very important, but the other one has been core to the adult education mission across Europe for decades. And I think the work of Paulo Freire in particular addressed that, and as a department here who subscribe to Freirean adult education, this is very, very important. So I would be saying that you need to be careful of the political, social and cultural remit of adult education that must be protected, so that we can allow new thinking to emerge that can contribute to shaping new paradigms for living in the future. So we must keep that very strong in everything that we do. In relation then to the discipline itself, it's coming into its own in Ireland because there are some regulations coming in with regard to teaching in further education, vocational education, training. All those sectors now are looking to professionalise the profession, to professionalise teaching in that sector. And this, I suppose, is interesting for us because it gives us an opportunity to insert our practice, our theory, our philosophy into education and to mainstream it in some way. I often think that it's interesting when you speak to groups of academics about adult education, they very often see it as continuing education, as a provision of courses, as an administrative clearinghouse. But when they experience the discipline, they often say, oh, we need more of this. We recently did a global cafe here in the Faculty of Social Science, and I was at a meeting this morning where the Dean was saying, this is wonderful, why don't we do more of this? And I was saying, well, actually we do that all the time in adult education, and it's underpinned by philosophy and theory that direct it. So it's not as if it was plucked out of the air. It's something that's thought through and is worthwhile. And I think when academics experience adult education as a discipline, as a practice, they're always very taken by it. And it's quite a surprise to them that they haven't had these experiences before. So I think there's a lot for adult education to contribute into further education and all the categories that I mentioned earlier, but also into higher education and how we can direct pedagogy and methodologies in higher education to improve learning and teaching. So I think the investment that has been made in education and in adult education over the last couple of decades, and it has happened in Ireland, so it has happened in other parts of Europe too, has resulted in a greater number of people with higher level qualifications. So the question for me is, what is happening to those now? The job market has shrunk. In Ireland at present, it needs skilled people, but very often it needs less qualified people than are available to take up the jobs. Many people with degrees are working in low-paid, unskilled jobs. And this begs the question, as far as I'm concerned, about what education is for. Is it for the workplace? Is it for personal development? Is it for developing creativity in people? What is it for? Because it doesn't appear to be for the workplace any longer. But one of the things that we do have is that we do have a very educated population of people with vast skills and knowledge. And if they're not going to use it in the workplace, then what are they going to use it for? Is there an opportunity here to bring people together, to look at ways of using their education, to invest in new ways of living and working together? And this goes back to points about new paradigms, sustainable living, localizing industry. Could adult education, for example, have a role in facilitating the advancement of thinking us into new ways of learning from each other in order to advance a society based on enough rather than the old paradigm of more, more, more? And I think that old notion of what growth should be is dying. It may resurrect itself, but certainly I think the long tail of capitalism is getting thinner, and certainly in the West, in Europe and in the States, I think it's struggling to survive. Maybe it's moving to other parts of the world, and of course that's another issue that I won't deal with today. But one of the things I think we need to keep in mind when we talk about funding is that money is only a means of exchange. Perhaps with less of it, we will find other ways of buying what we need. I really do think that this is a moment in history when we need to think outside the box. There again is a lot of rhetoric and discourses about the need for innovation and creativity. And we have a lot of that in store, in the education population that we have, in all the artists that we put through art college that now can't find work, in all the designers, in all the scientists, in all the educators and social scientists. And a lot of people can't find work. It's time to bring them together and start to collaborate and work with the environments that we're in and try and develop a new future for ourselves. What that is in question. It's bad news, I suppose, for people who are looking forward to a future of a growth economy and a lot of work. But for those of us who've come through that period, who had the good times, as you say, and indeed I lived through the bad times of the 80s in Ireland when most people were emigrating, and I remember them very well, and I remember the rhetoric of the upskilling and the need for more education, and I'm hearing it all now again. There are gains and losses in all of that. High productivity means less time for enjoying the world that we're in, and less time for family, and less time for a lot of things that are very, very important. Less time for looking after our health. So we may be looking at a different future, but for me, I think it's no less the brighter if we can think that all we need is enough. We don't need more. So I leave you on that thought. Thank you for listening, and I hope